Good morning, friends. My name is Darren St. George, and welcome to another Monday morning program with Sal St. George. If you've been with us before, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to see you. If this is your first time, welcome to the party. This is how we start each and every week, celebrating entertainment's leaders, legends, and icons, and this morning is, of course, no exception. We are heading to Staten Island, New York to visit the Alice Austen House. We'll be joined with their executive director, Victoria Monuro. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. Please share them in the chat and I'll happily relay those over to Victoria and Sal. And speaking of Sal, let's get to the man of the hour. Sal, Dad, are you there?
Buongiorno. Good morning.
Hey, Pop, how's it going?
This is nice having somebody from New York.
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
You know, we sometimes we have guests that are in California, and all we hear to them, do you know what time we had to get up to be here today? But this is nice. This is great having somebody right in our backyard.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, let's get to it. Victoria, are you there?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi,
Hi, Victoria. Good morning.
Victoria, tell us, how long have you been with the library, with the museum?
So I started with the Alice Austen House in 2015 to write women's history programs. And that's when I needed to do a lot of research into the story, find out who the woman was, and was so compelled and felt that the museum could be so much more to serve the incredible legacy of Alice Austen. And I became the executive director in 2017.
So what was it that gave you that vision that you knew it could be much more?
Well, Alice Austen is, she was born in 1866 and she lived until 1952. She was a Victorian woman who took over 8,000 photographs in her lifetime, but she was one of the very first women in America to photograph outside of the studio. And her story was so little known for several reasons. And for me, it was a real passion project to be able to bring that story to the public, to make her archives accessible to those that perhaps can't even make it to Staten Island, because I know that the Alice Austen House is very much a destination. And also, Alice Austen was a lesbian woman who had a loving relationship with her partner, Gertrude Tate, for 55 years.
Wow.
Yet that story really had not been told. And it had been championed by the LGBTQ community for many, many years. Yet it wasn't truly celebrated at the museum. And I felt that that was incredibly important and that we had a lot of work to do to repair our relationship with the community.
And who's your audience?
So our audience, we serve over 6,000 New York school children per year with programs that range from one-off museum visits to full up to 20-week in-school programs. All of our programs are photographic arts-based. So we're giving hands-on workshops to children, but also following the curriculum with social studies and all of these other areas, which really enrich a child's learning experience. And then we serve over 20,000 visitors per year to our site. And the house itself, which you'll see soon, was built in 1690. So it's one of New York's oldest homes, but it also sits on a 15-acre waterfront park. And New Yorkers absolutely adore their parkland. And this is a really, really important site for New York City history. It's right on the New York City harbor. So it was known as the first house on the left. So, you know, during the late 1800s, New York City was seeing immigration at its highest point, and those immigrants came in via boat, and they passed the Alice Austen House.
Oh, that's perfect. We have a question already, and we were wondering, is it possible to walk there from the ferry?
So unfortunately, yes, you can. You can do it. It would take about half an hour. But unfortunately, in terms of when I'm talking about waterfront, the waterfront access on Staten Island isn't hasn't come as far yet as what you have in places like Brooklyn, where they've renovated the whole waterfront of Dumbo, which all used to be sort of gated and more industrial. It's still relatively industrial. So my recommendation, the fastest way to get from the ferry to the Alice Austen House is it's around about a 5-minute bus ride, and the buses go straight from the ferry terminal, and it will drop you right at the corner, which you just walk down one street and you're at the Alice Austen House. Or you can take an Uber or cycle. You can take your bicycle on the ferry. The Staten Island Ferry is actually New York City's largest tourist attraction. A lot of people don't know that, but the ridership is phenomenal and it's free. So you can have this incredible view of the Statue of Liberty, which, of course, during Alice Austen's time, she saw be erected and she photographed it.
Can we see some of those photos today? Are they available?
Certainly, they're available on our website. We have our collections are digitized. And because there's such a huge amount, I will be showing you some of the photographs on our virtual tour of the museum. But you should certainly, I would advise everyone to thoroughly explore the website, because there's so many resources that will really enrich what I'm going to be able to tell you today.
Victoria, you intrigued me with the school children that you meet with, and they come to your place or you go to their schools. We did a program a number of years ago about a photographer, a woman photographer. Her name was Toni Frisell.
Mm-hmm.
And she was one of the first women to go into World War II and photograph. It was primarily, as you would know, it was primarily a male dominated field, and she was one of the females. When we had children come in to see the program, because it was a live stage program, they had no idea what a camera was. When we took out the camera to show her cameras and all, they had no clue. They're so accustomed to using their telephone now.
Yeah, so one of our main programs focuses on immigration and New York City history, and we teach the children how to use cameras that actually involve film, because just the very concept of this physical strip of film that would develop using light and these processes. We certainly use digital cameras as well in our programs. But one of the things that we do is we show them Alice's camera. We show them the glass plate negatives, which is another wow.
That's wonderful, though. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and to learn how a negative works and even actually be able to physically touch the materials is really important. But we also give them disposable cameras to take out into the community, and they photograph their families and interview relatives, and it's a real celebration of their own cultural and community history. So it's all of the programs are incredibly affirming, and they're an exploration of their personal identities, and they get a visual history. When they finish the program, we create books with them. They have their own photo albums. Most children don't even have an album. Like, we take for granted. I'm, middle-aged, so I have all of my albums from childhood and printed photographs, but most kids actually don't even get to have a photograph that's printed outside of perhaps their school photos, which still their parents have to pay for. And for a lot of families, that kind of thing is actually out of reach in New York City. And the Alice Austen House mostly teaches at Title I schools, which means these are schools that are very high needs. And so a lot of the children don't have the very equitable access to arts education.
Well, I commend you for introducing the camera. That is really wonderful. Okay, you have a slideshow you wanted to introduce to us.
I'm going to pop in before then because I came across this.
Wonderful. Yes.
Thank you, Darren.
Yeah. So, interestingly, they at this time when they first erected the Statue of Liberty, they gave out special souvenirs, mini statues, which Alice Austen owned one. But as I unfold the story of this woman, she was a woman of privilege. Later in her life, she lost all of her money, and she was one of the things that she sold to try and stay in her beloved home was her Statue of Liberty memento.
Wow. Incredible.
And
yes.
you'll notice in that picture, there's not very many women. It was pretty much a man's world.
Okay.
Can you also, we'd love to see your slideshow. And as you pull that up, can you tell us, we have some appreciation for your Staten Island accent.
Oh, yes. I think you asked me about how I came to the Alice Austen House, but I should explain for your audience. I am originally from New Zealand. I've been living in New York for over 27 years. And I went to high school on a cliff top. New Zealand's two small islands, and so we're surrounded by water. So when I discovered Staten Island in 2008, I felt at home in a way to be on an island. And then the Alice Austen House, I couldn't have hoped for a more picturesque setting and one that really, being very, very, very far from New Zealand keeps me close to the water.
Do you still have family there?
All my family's in New Zealand, yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing your talents with New York.
Okay. So I hope that everyone can see this. So the software that I'm using today to share this tour of the house, it's called Matterport. So it's a 3D software that allows us to move through the museum. Every virtual tour is available on our website at www.aliceausten.org. And because Alice was a photographer, we are also a photographic platform for contemporary and historic photographic exhibitions. And we have 9 changing exhibitions a year, 3 in our main galleries. So there is a new virtual tour created for every single exhibition. So on the website, you're able to see exactly what is happening right now at the Alice Austen House. So let's enter. So you are at the front of the house, which is facing the water. As I said, this house was known as the first house on the left, but the family named this house Clear Comfort. So originally it was a 2-room Dutch farmhouse built in 1690, as I said. And as we move forward, this is the entrance. So when you come to visit us, you will enter through the hallway, which is the original 1690 part of the building. And the first image that you'll see as you walk through the front door is this really striking photograph of Alice. She's fiercely looking at the camera. She's around about 22 years old in this photograph. And this image was actually taken by her uncle Oswald. And he was a Danish sea captain, and he brought Alice back her first camera from his travels when she was around about age 10. So by the age of 22, when this photograph is taken, she was highly proficient in photography. And she always developed all of her photographs herself and printed everything in a small upstairs closet of what we know now as the Alice Austen House, and what the family called this house, which was Clear Comfort. Alice was not born at Clear Comfort. She was born at a small house that's no longer existing, just up the road from this home. But Alice's mother was abandoned by her father. And so Alice, at a very young age, possibly around about 1 year old, moved into the family home. And so her mother and herself moved to the family home, and she dropped her father's surname. They never used it. And so she retained the name Austen. She was born Elizabeth Alice Munn, and she would go by Alice and Austen for the rest of her life. Now, there are three historical rooms, but one of the transformations that was so important to my work was reinterpreting the entire museum, which was achieved in 2019, to move from what was before presented as a historic house full of antiques to focusing on Alice's photographs to tell the story. Now, the first room that you would enter if you're visiting the Alice Austen House is the parlor. You'll notice these lolly columns here and here. We're constantly preserving the house. So there's a large capital project that is being designed right now to secure these beams. These were put in 1725, so they've got some age on them. And this house that Alice moved into was full of people. So Alice was raised like an only child without a father in a home that was bustling. So what I'm going to do is take you over to here. I don't want to make you too seasick, but I want to be able to spin around. So you can see you can also do this all by yourself at home.
Victoria, how long has this been a museum?
So the house opened its doors in 1985. However, the home itself was slated for demolition to build high-rise apartments. And that was back in the 60s. And local people and historians fought to save it. It was able to be landmarked. And then ownership was passed to the city of New York. So the historic houses in New York are owned by New York City Parks Department. But there was no funds to renovate the house. It was really falling into the ground by that stage. And it wasn't until 1984 that the Staten Island Borough president donated $1 million, that you could do a lot with $1 million back in the 80s. And with a lot of community effort, the house was restored using all of Alice Austen's photographs. So things like these woodwork and they are redone, but the structure itself and the floorboards are all original. And then the current iteration that really tells Alice's story was installed in 2019. It was the first time we ever were able to achieve overhead lighting in the museum.
And I commend you for making that leap. So many museums, they've stayed at that level where it's a historic house museum left as though people just walked away from their home and you step in there, but you're really you're using the space to tell a story now. That's
well,
great.
we're so lucky because we have this incredibly rich visual archive to work with. And prior to this iteration, there was only around about 20 of Alice's photographs on display in the entire museum. And in fact, the first time I visited the Alice Austen House, back when I was just exploring Staten Island, when I left, I did not know that Alice was a photographer.
Oh.
So that wasn't the story that was really being celebrated or presented, the virtuosity of her work. So this wall, I can't take you too close, fairly close. When Alice moved into the house, this is Alice in the center, around about, I think, 2 years old. When Alice moved into this home, all of these characters lived here. So I think it's a really important piece to understanding her, because people are like, how did this woman go out into the world, do so many things? And I think a part of it is that she was raised with all of these adults that doted on her and allowed her really so many more freedoms than what Victorian young girls were generally. They didn't have high expectations for them to become professionals and do this kind of work that she did. So her grandfather, John Haggerty Austen here, he purchased Clear Comfort in 1844. And this is his wife, Alice's grandmother, Elizabeth Townsend. So they were living in the city and they lost two of their children to sickness, two of their sons, and they decided to make Staten Island their full-time home. That was when John renovated the house to the way it looks today. He added dormers on the upstairs windows and created this Victorian Gothic cottage. Also here is Alice Austen's cousin Peter, who is the closest in age to her. He would have been around 16 years old when she moved to the house. Peter was also an avid photographer, and he was a chemist. This is her mother. And her mother lived at the house until her death and shared a room with Alice Austen until the turn of the century, 1900. There was also 3 Irish maids living in this small house, and her Aunt Min, who was married to the Danish sea captain, Oswald. And Min's a really fascinating character. She was really talented, musically skilled, and she spent most of her time at sea with Oswald. In fact, so much time aboard ship that she lost all of her hair. Sometimes they would only have potatoes to eat for months on end. Oswald's here, presented in a lantern slide. And this is Gertrude Tate, a loving portrait taken in the parlor, which is the room that we're in right now. And Gertrude would move into Clear Comfort in 1917 until her and Alice were evicted in 1945.
Victoria, is there any family lineage between Alice and Jane Austen?
No. That wowould be nice.
Yes.
And then, of course, you have the other story of another Alice and Gertrude. And then, in fact, when I was speaking to you earlier today, we were discussing the fact, with the Austen name being E-N, even Alice herself has been miscredited so many times because the I-N spelling is more common for Austen. Yes. So, we have searched for various connections to other Austens, but alas, no.
Well, we can be content with Alice herself.
Right.
Thank you.
Victoria, you said that they were evicted in 1945.
Yes.
And what happened to the house between 45 and when it became a museum? Were there people living in it? Was it abandoned?
So to just backpedal just a tiny bit, Alice lost all of her money in the stock market crash of 1929. And her and Gertrude struggled to maintain Clear Comfort and stay there. So what that meant was, they were a typical Victorian family that was, very comfortable and had means. They collected things from all over the world. Alice had to sell all of her possessions to try and stay in the house. And by 1945, her and Gertrude were evicted. And so a lot of our collections have been gathered piecemeal over time. Now, when the bank owned the house and then sold it to a family called, now I'm blanking for 1 second. I don't want to mispronounce their surname, but it was sold to a family. And what the family discovered, they're still a local Staten Island family, the Mendias, was that one of the things that was left behind in the haste to leave the house was a huge letter collection, which was boxes and boxes of letters that Alice had kept. Alice was actually a hoarder and never threw anything out. So you can imagine how hard it was for her to part with so many of her beautiful possessions. And they donated most of that letter collection back to when the museum opened in 1985. So the house went through several different iterations before being saved by being landmarked and then nearly falling into the ground through lack of funding to preserve it. There was a group that was formed called Friends of Alice Austen, which is what the nonprofit that I run now. And the original members comprised people such as Bernice Abbott, the famous photographer, Edward Steichen, another powerful photographer, Margot Gale, the Victorian preservationist. And their dream was for this to reopen, to the house to reopen and be a photographic museum, but a living, breathing photographic museum, which is what it is today with its changing contemporary exhibitions. Alice and Gertrude took a small apartment in St. George, which is the neighborhood that's right by the ferry and a part of your name. And they couldn't financially maintain. They were both more senior in years, particularly Alice, and Alice suffered terrible arthritis. And when they could no longer afford to stay in their apartment, Gertrude's family said, you can come back and live with us in Brooklyn, but we will not take in Alice because it is the wrong kind of devotion. So Alice signed a note to say she had less than $20 to her name, and she was admitted to the Staten Island poorhouse. So it's a very tragic story. Riches to rags. And she was discovered in 1951 by a man named Oliver Jensen, who was a part of that first Friends of Alice Austen to work towards saving the home and the legacy. And he was writing a book called The Revolt of the American Woman, which is out of print, but available to get fairly cheaply on Amazon or other secondhand book sellers. I recommend it. He was looking at historical societies throughout America for visual documentation of women through history in the US. And he came across the Alice Austen glass plate negative collection, which was at that stage at historic Richmond Town, where many of them still are on Staten Island. Alice and Gertrude had been incredibly active in preservation on Staten Island. And when she was being evicted, she called the executive director of the Staten Island Historical Society and said, take my glass plate negatives so that they wouldn't be taken by an antique dealer or destroyed. She really realized the value in the historical document that they were of a changing New York City. You know, we have to remember that she was born 1 year after the Civil War ended, and by the time she was photographing at her highest point was in the 1890s and 1880s. This was a time of huge shifts in technology and in the whole way that New York City was run. The sanitation department was, a new thing. You know, they used to have pigs roaming the street to help clean up. So she was really documenting this whole Gilded Age, as we call it. And some of your listeners might have seen the TV series, The Gilded Age. And many of the locations that show has been shot in, Alice Austen actually photographed too. And so it's really quite special.
Is Alice's name recognized in the photographic community?
I think it really is beginning to be now. So when you have been poverty stricken, like a lot of that legacy went away, but Alice also was a woman that for the earlier part of her career didn't have to rely on photography to make a living. Although she did take paid assignments, part of that sort of loss of history is A, she was a woman, and B, she was a queer woman. So what happened after her death was that narrative, the truthful narrative of her loving relationship with Gertrude Tate was not in the open. It was actively closeted. And I think through that and, you know, the fact that many of her things were scattered, the loss of wealth really impacted the ability for the public to access any information about Alice. And then the house itself, when it opened as a museum, the focus had become so placed on the architecture of the house instead of the stories that went along with it. The architecture is very important, but I think the story is more powerful than the house itself.
Can we see another part of the house?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll just take you over here for one second.
We'll follow you.
So Alice was an avid gardener. She was the founding member of the Staten Island Garden Club. She was one of the founding members of the Staten Island Bicycle Club. So you can start to see these lush gardens that surround. She photographed her gardens. She had celebrations of her plants. So here she's dressed up in the wintertime by her beloved wisteria, which she allowed to nearly destroy part of the house by letting it keep growing. The Austens would bring back plantings from all over the world. So there's a lot of invasive plants that they brought in and grew from seedlings. But it's an important part to acknowledge these clubs that Alice created, because essentially what she was also doing was she was creating safe space for women to be together without male chaperones, because she chose activities that were deemed acceptable for women to do, like gardening and bicycling was a new activity that they could do without a male chaperone. And she formed these clubs to be together. So we're going to move back into this 1690 hallway. And we see the original Dutch door from 1690. And we see Alice perched on a fence post to get her photograph of, she is taking photographs of an automobile race. Now, Alice was, it is said, and we don't have anything to dispute this, but to be the first woman on Staten Island to own a car. And she knew how to fix it too. She would have a toolkit with her. They often broke down. She would own several automobiles. And this is Gertrude Tate looking at the photographer who's capturing this very unladylike, for the time, picture of Alice Austen. And she would promote photography for women and promote ways in which to capture your photographs using rudimentary materials, tying cameras to trees if you needed to steady to get your shot, all sorts of things. In this hallway, we have a history of Staten Island through Alice's photographs. We see the ferry, which actually doesn't look that different today. So Alice would take her bicycle with her camera equipment, up to 50 pounds of it, to the ferry and take that Staten Island ferry into the city to photograph people on the streets of New York. As we move down the hallway, there's a small door here which leads to the upstairs, which is not open to the public because it's not accessible, but up those stairs is Alice's darkroom. So I'm just going to spin you around so you can see we have an interpretive panel here that talks about the darkroom. And if I can sneak the stairs, we can look up the stairs, and there's a light box here. And on this light box, it is Alice's maid. Just steady that. And Alice took a photograph of her maid washing prints at the well at the rear of the house for an article that she published for women to show them how they could have a dark room at home. And the house had no running water or electricity. So she was able to achieve these really incredibly superior photographs in this cupboard. So you are now in Alice Austen's darkroom. So it is as it was when she lived there. It's a very simple set of shelves and drawers, which she would have kept her materials in. And this darkroom was set up for her by Alice's Uncle Peter and Uncle Oswald. But Alice would be very resolute about the fact that she was self-taught. And so that was something at the end of her life when she was discovered in the poorhouse that she was very insistent upon wanting the public to know that she was self-taught. There was, of course, camera clubs at the time, and women were actively involved in those, but with very in-depth research, we have never been able to find any evidence of Alice joining one of those clubs. She had been asked to represent in various clubs and never took up the offers. Now, this image here, which sits just outside of what would have been the dining room, is a tennis group. And Alice is on this side, and she's hiding her shutter release cable, which allowed her to take these photographs with herself included, behind her pug dog, Punch. And so Punch would have been one of the first pugs in America. As I said, they were a classic Victorian family. They loved exotic things. Even one trip, Aunt Min brought back black squirrels and donated them to the Central Park Zoo. So whenever we see black squirrels in the park, we think they might be descendants of Min's. But Alice photographed this tennis group, and tennis is actually really fascinating as well, particularly on Staten Island. Staten Island was the first place in America to play the game of tennis. It was brought to America by a woman named Mary Outerbridge from Bermuda. And it was introduced to America at a time when they allowed men and women to play doubles together. And so there was a tennis club that was formed that women could be a part of, but in Staten Island, they broke away and built their own clubhouse and had their own tennis club. And Alice Austen was a champion tennis player. So she was incredibly sporty, incredibly physical, and took wonderful photographs of tennis. And I was mentioning the Gilded Age because there was a lot of tennis matches that were played in Newport. And Alice Austen photographed those grounds. So now we'll step down.
Excuse me, Victoria. I'm recollecting that photograph of the Statue of Liberty. I know
Yes.
it was a while ago, but was she recognized by there were dozens of newspapers and periodicals and magazines? Would they pursue her to get photographs, or was there a discrimination simply because she was a woman?
So it's a very, very good question. She self-published this set of photographs, which she called Street Types of New York. So when I mentioned that she would take up to 50 pounds of photographic equipment onto the streets of New York City, she would photograph these immigrant communities and immigrants at work. So early sanitation worker, newsie, these kids that would sell newspapers on the street. They were often orphans. Bootblacks, there's a pretzel seller, a bicycle courier. What's so fabulous about New York is it's such a capsule of history that you can go to these locations now, and in some instances, they haven't changed all that much. So she self-published and copyright these sets of photographs, but she took hundreds of photographs on the street of New York, and they're very distinctly Alice Austen. A lot of people ask, well, was she friends with Jacob Riis? Was she friends with these other men that were photographing on the streets of New York City? And we don't have any evidence of that. I'm sure she knew of their work. She would read photographic magazines. But this, what I'm about to show you, was a 10-year engagement photographing the Quarantine Islands. Now, I think we all shudder at the fact that we're not that long out of quarantine ourselves. So I talked about these immigrant boats that would actually pass by the Alice Austen House. Just up the road and still there is the Coast Guard. And at that Coast Guard station, that would be where the ships would be inspected.
Can you get any closer to these photos? Ah, there we go.
So here, this boat here, that's called the Wadsworth. Fort Wadsworth is just up the road, right by where the Coast Guard is situated. And so they would inspect the boats, and if they found any evidence of disease or illness, immigrants in some instances would be sent all the way back home after a terribly arduous journey, or they would be sent to quarantine stations on these man-made islands, Hoffman and Swinburne Island. A lot of people don't know, they just hear about Ellis Island. So Alice was employed by this man here. He was the Coast Guard's doctor. He kitted out the Wadsworth to be sort of a mobile cleaning ship. But this is filled with immigrants in this photo that are being sent to the quarantine stations, which you can see today from South Beach on Staten Island. They're now bird sanctuaries. They're just not being used for anything. But so Alice photographed all of this new technology. She was fascinated by technology. And so they had these huge chambers that would steam the bedwear and disinfect it. And the beds themselves were, had the ability, everything could be hosed down. And her photographs of the quarantine stations were actually exhibited at the Buffalo World's Fair in 1901 in the sanitation wing. But so often, and as with an article that was published all about the way the boat functioned and disinfecting and all of these things, Alice Austen wasn't credited. So it was credited to the work of Dr. Doty. But as a photographer, she was not credited. So yeah, it's a complex and long and winding journey to really recognize why Alice was not as well known as she should be.
Is that her camera?
This is her camera that she purchased in 1901. It's got beautiful bellows. I'm going to turn around so you can see it a little better.
Yeah, if you can get closer, that would be great.
I'm trying my best here. Maybe open that.
But most of these pictures are on your website, correct?
They're all on the website. It's easier when I'm not into presentation view to really get closer, especially if you've got a touch screen. This technology is very responsive. But yes, so we have her camera now on display. When I first visited the Alice Austen House, this room was filled with a huge dining table, huge sideboard, and a potbelly fireplace. And it had one photograph of a tree on the wall. Now, as I said, I didn't actually realize then that Alice was a photographer, but none of that furniture was hers. It looked similar, but it wasn't hers. And I didn't feel that was really a way to connect with our audiences and teach them about this story. This wall here is called the Larky Life. That's what Alice called a period in her life when she was in her, 20s and 30s, racing around, involved with all of these clubs, playing tennis, taking photographs, traveling through America and the world. And this is Alice here. And this photograph is called the Darned Club. So it was another club that Alice created that was for women only. And the story had always been that it was called the Darned Club, and it was nicknamed that by men because they weren't allowed entry into the club. But the woman actually came up with that name themselves. They weren't doing a hell of a lot of darning or needlepoint. All of her friend group are fascinating, and delving into their stories during COVID. The pause gave us time. I worked with a researcher, Pamela Bannis, for 2 years, really looking into the histories of each of the women that we see. Now, also on this wall, you'll see that these are sort of freestanding reproductions of Alice's photographs. So Alice only contact printed. So the size of her photograph is photographs are representatives of the glass plates that she used. So each camera took a different size. Now, I was interested to find out, was there a chronology of cameras? No, she worked with different cameras, sometimes up to 4 in, one photo shoot, if you like. And these are
And she carried all that herself?
Yes, she would have most likely, she would have had one of her friends accompany her.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
This house is extraordinarily large.
It feels large, but it's actually pretty small. So over here, I talked about bicycling. So Alice's friend, Violet Ward, her name's Maria Ward, she went by Violet, published a book in 1896 called Bicycling for Ladies. And Alice and Violet set up a makeshift photo studio out on the lawn just outside of this window. And they took photographs of their very close friend. And at the time, Daisy was Alice's lover in 1896. They took photographs of Daisy Elliott, who was a gymnast and ran a women's gymnasium in Manhattan with the bicycle to teach women how to correctly stand, maintain a bike, also what to wear. So Daisy's wearing bloomers in this photograph, and was relatively scandalous at the time. They also put Daisy in a dress for some of her poses because they knew that they needed to appeal to a conservative wing of women. But the book just got republished in 2001, and I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to write a foreword. So you can purchase Bicycling for Ladies now. And it's actually a really, really enjoyable read. And if you're interested in women's history and the role of sports within that, I think it's a must-have. We have a screen that's dedicated to Alice and Gertrude. So formerly also, Alice was always presented pretty much at age 22, but she lived a long life into her 80s, and she photographed well into the 20th century. So this slideshow encompasses images of Alice and Gertrude throughout their lives. The last photograph that Alice took was actually when she was brought back. She was discovered in the poorhouse, and she was brought back to her home and photographed there that day. By then, she was in a wheelchair. Now, we also have an architectural reveal. So this is the 1690 wall. So it's interesting just to see this sort of what are some of the bones of the house and what we deal with in terms of preservation and keeping we have to be very creative with our preservation work to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the home. And as I said, we only just achieved overhead lighting in 2019, and all of that is controlled through the internet. So there's not a single light switch or anything like that that's put onto the walls that would, affect that aesthetic. And as I said, we're not presenting ourselves as this sort of historic reenactment. It's all about Alice. And I discussed the contemporary galleries.
Victoria, what are your future plans for the museum? You look like you're the type of person that has plans going for the next 5-10 years.
Yes, absolutely. It's a 30-year sort of vision, because the park itself, offers a huge amount of potential for public programs and community networking. And so last year I launched the Queer Ecologies Garden. That is a garden that celebrates the queer history at the house, the history of the garden and plants for LGBTQ people. And the plants in that garden are all non-binary, intersex. They're able to change their genders. They self-seed. And so we starting to teach children about horticulture and the public in a way that affirms so many of, what is core to our mission, and telling Alice's story, also that wonderful history where she was the board president and founding member of the Staten Island Garden Club. that garden is being extended to a full pollinator native garden that will span the entire course of a long winding driveway. And then, the big project I'm working on this year is a signage project. So the park itself doesn't have any interpretation. So it's my belief that you shouldn't actually have to cross the threshold of the front door to really get a sense of the history and the place where you are. So that is a large undertaking that's currently in design right now so that people really understand that the park is for them. I just achieved removing all fences from the park. So we are truly a park without borders. And I would love to see, obviously, a big resilience plan in place for the waterfront because we were impacted by Hurricane Sandy. And I would like to see the beach having a full walking access. People fish, people really, there's a lot of recreation that happens around the Alice Austen House, but it could be so much more. And so that's really my focus right now is obviously on all the contemporary curatorial work and supporting photographers and creating new education programs. But this waterfront resilience and creating a space that is really, truly a community anchor.
I like that, the community anchor.
Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to see the last space. I just want to sneak in a couple of questions.
Sure, I'll just move us through the space while you ask questions.
So first, great comment by Jeff. If Alice were around today, I'm sure she would be an Instagram celebrity.
Yes.
How many women belong to these clubs? The camera, the bicycling, the tennis? Any estimation on that?
Yes. So some of the clubs were actually fairly small. Like the Darn Club, it was directly Alice's circle. Tennis was definitely larger, and there's some wonderful histories of women's tennis in America. So the Staten Island Tennis Club would have been, and the tennis membership would have been, I would estimate, well over 60. And you have to understand that Staten Island is still our most least populous borough. So a lot of it was farmland, and it's very bucolic still on Staten Island. We're the greenest borough. So there wasn't a huge population for some of these clubs, but nonetheless, I think it's historically incredibly inspiring that Alice did this. And Staten Island was also a more conservative borough, which it still is today. And so the work that we do in terms of representation, I say, is even more important because of that. There's not a lot of space for young people to really celebrate their identities. And then this is the sunroom. This is the final room dedicated to the memory and legacy of Alice Austen and Gertrude Tate. And this room is an active workshop, art space. These are multifunctional cabinets. They're all filled with printers and cameras that are used by the community and, by our students. And a year ago, we also acquired an aura camera, which is a huge $20,000 rig that once a month we photograph people's auras when they're in the house. So that's like your energy, and it's different colors. And it's like a wonderful experience. I think part of coming to the Alice Austen House, it's all about this experiential. It's a destination. If you come to New York City, it's one of the most wonderful things you can do. And people come from all over the world.
Victoria, what kind of hours does your museum keep?
It's Tuesday to Saturday from 12 to 5. We actually have the most opening hours of any cultural institution on the island.
Last question before I show people how to connect with the museum. In the inevitable biopic of Alice, who would you like to cast to play the role of Alice? And there's one suggestion here for Kate Winslet.
She's wonderful in a historical drama, isn't she?
Yes.
She would be one of my top picks as well. I think she has that strength in her face as well to carry a role like Alice. You know, she was no wallflower. She was, you know, a trailblazer, and you would need an actress as strong as Kate Winslet to really fulfill that role. And, you know, watch this space, because you asked me what was on the list of future
Yes.
plans. It's definitely that.
And you said there's a new book that is being developed right now?
There is. It is authored by a woman named Bonnie Yokelson, and it will be published by Duke University Press, because the last book that was published, believe it or not, was in 1976 by a woman named Anne Novotny. And the research is fantastic for that book, and we own the entire archive of that research. However, the book itself, when Anne was publishing it, she certainly could not have had it published if she had told the truthful narrative of Alice and Gertrude. And she actually wrote an article about that constraint. And the book lacks an index, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's a wonderful book. I have a copy right here that I use all the time. I'll show the audience very quickly. So it's called Alice's World. And it's a lovely picture book. It's very accessible, and the information is wonderful inside. There just needs to be more, you know. So we're excited about this project. We've worked with Bonnie to help her with her research. She's worked across the two main archives, which is, and obviously there's more out there. A large collection of Alice's photographs is available on, if you're interested in those street types, at the NYPL, the New York Public Library. They have them all digitized and available online. Historic Richmond Town has about 600 photographs available online. And the Library of Congress also has a large collection of the street types. The Alice Austen House itself has around about 450 printed photographs and 100 glass plate negatives, and it's growing all the time. Because people are now learning of the work that we are doing, relatives are getting in contact with us. I can stop screen sharing now if you like.
I'll take over that.
You take over that. Thank you. And are donating back to us. So our collections are expanding. So that's just so exciting. But what it does mean, we're really, really busy digitizing those to be able to make them available to everyone. And for scholarly research, that's really important, because a book isn't the be all and end all. Alice's story is still unfolding. We find out new things every day.
And speaking of wanting to learn new things every day, if you want to learn more of Alice's story, you can follow along Alice Austen House on TikTok. They're right here with lots of fun programs and video. We're also on Instagram. You can click that follow button right there. You can follow them on Facebook, of course. And I'm curious, what's happening here in this garden? Is this the garden?
If you're on Instagram right now.
On Facebook. Can you see the screen there for the Facebook sharing?
I can't see.
Oh, that's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's just a cover photo. It looks like they're repairing or expanding
wheelbarrows and digging.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, that's when we launched the Queer Ecologies Garden last spring. And that's working with the New York Restoration Project, which are a wonderful nonprofit that go into parks and help parks with projects in what could be called unloved spaces, or, you know, areas that are not utilized that can be. And so they assisted the Alice Austen House and have continued to do programs with us. We teach mycology, we teach composting, so many things. So yeah, it's a really, really exciting organization that's really worthy of you. And we will be honoring them this year at our gala at the National Arts Club in the city.
We found here one of the aura pictures.
Oh, great.
Facebook.
Fantastic.
Incredible. Very impressive. And you can learn more, aliceausten.org. Very simply, it's in the chat. I'm going to drop it in once again. That's where you can go. And all of these links will be shared with you later in the week with our follow-up email. Plenty to explore, great ways to donate and support the museum, as well as plan your visit. You can also go to their gift shop. Lots of things here to enjoy, reprints, some clothing, and bicycling for ladies. This has been the recommendation. If you want to pick it up directly from there, there you go. It's in the chat. Also, all of the virtual road trips, not virtual tours, not just the ones that we saw today, but others of all of their exhibits that have been in the past. You can follow those as well. Lots of fun things to keep you busy. You can follow Celebrity Museums on Facebook. We're there, of course, see, promoting for today. Instagram, we're on there, as well as on YouTube. You can watch today's program. We'll have it up there shortly. We're also on X. And what are we talking about? Rod Serling today, Pop?
Rod Serling, yeah.
Yeah, what's happening? What's happening with him? Just good photos?
Underneath is a great quote. If you go back again.
Yep.
There you go. Click on that picture right there. And that's a quote from 1964, if you'd like to read it.
Hatred is not the norm. Prejudice is not the norm. Suspicion, dislike, jealousy, and scapegoating, none of these things in the transient facet of the human personality. They are the diseases. They are the cancer of the soul. They are the infectious and contagious viruses that have bled humanity over the years. But because they have been and are is not necessarily that they shall be. Rod Serling, 1964. Wow.
Great quote.
Yeah, the man can write. CelebrityMuseums.com, where you can sign up for all of our programs, all of our virtual road trips. We have more photography coming up with photographer O. Winston Link. We're going to be heading over there. We have the Volo Museum, and we have lectures. Next week, we have one of our favorite friends coming back, Rick Sapphire. Finally, his embargo has been lifted, and he's going to be able to tell us all the behind-the-scenes stories of not just Jerry Lewis, but all of lots more of Hollywood history. And in September, we have The Twilight Zone. We'll be talking a lot more of Rod Serling.
And sitcom for working women.
Yes. I didn't get to co-host that with you last time, Pop. So I'm excited that we're having Judy back, and I'll get to be a part of it this time.
Victoria, I have to tell you, New Zealand's loss is our gain. We're so glad that you accepted our invitation, and this was a wonderful, wonderful new information that we had no idea about, and that's what we're about.
That's great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye, all.